The first crack of thunder was a cannon shot that ripped the sky in half. Not a distant rumble, but a visceral, deafening explosion directly overhead that shook the very marrow in his bones. Arthur Vance screamed, a raw, involuntary sound torn from his throat as he scrambled backward, slipping on the slick, moss-covered rock. His hand, already scraped and bloody, slid through a slurry of mud and pine needles, and a sharp, white-hot pain lanced through his ankle. He cried out again, the sound swallowed by the sudden, torrential downpour that followed the thunder's echo. The forest, which moments before had been a cathedral of serene, sun-dappled green, was now a churning, violent abyss of whipping branches and blinding sheets of water. His $1,000 all-weather gear felt as useless as tissue paper. His satellite phone, the one he'd boasted could get a signal from the bottom of a mine shaft, was a dead, useless brick in his pocket. He was alone. Utterly and terrifyingly alone. He pushed his soaked hair from his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice pathetic against the storm's fury. "Is anyone out there? I need help." The only answer was the roar of the wind, a sound that seemed to mock his pathetic plea, a sound that whispered a single, chilling word he had never truly understood until this very moment. Lost. Arthur had never been lost in his life. He navigated boardrooms with the predatory grace of a shark, charted the volatile currents of the stock market from his penthouse office that overlooked a city he considered his own personal chessboard. He didn't get lost. He created the maps others were forced to follow. At 52, Arthur Vance was a monument to ruthless efficiency, a man whose net worth was discussed in hushed, reverent tones in publications he secretly despised but publicly courted. His life was a meticulously curated series of victories, each one built on the wreckage of a competitor's failure. He had 3 ex-wives, 2 children who spoke to him only through their trust fund lawyers, and a portfolio that was the envy of Wall Street. He had mistaken this accumulation of assets for a life. The wilderness, he'd thought, would be just another acquisition. He'd arrived in the small, forgotten town of Silver Creek 2 days prior, his black German sedan, a stark slash of modernity against the rustic, fading storefronts. He was there to finalize the purchase of 10,000 acres of pristine, untouched forest, a parcel of land the locals considered sacred, but which his analysts had identified as the perfect location for the new flagship Vance Elysian Resort and Spa. A sanctuary for the 1%, carved out of the heart of what the world had carelessly left behind. The locals had been quaint. The town's mayor, a portly man with a sweat-stained collar and a desperate smile, had practically handed him the keys to the city. But there were others, the ones who stood at the back of the town hall meeting, their faces etched with a stony blend of resentment and resignation. An old woman in a faded floral dress had stood up, her voice trembling but clear. "That forest is alive, Mr. Vance. It has a memory. You can't just pave over a memory." Arthur had given her his signature smile, the one that was all teeth and no warmth, and delivered a polished line about progress, jobs, and symbiotic prosperity. He hadn't heard a word she'd said. Not really. To him, her voice was just static, the meaningless noise of a past he was being paid handsomely to erase. He'd decided to hike a section of the property himself. It was a whim, a rare impulse in a life governed by schedules and data points. He'd scoffed at the mayor's offer of a local guide. "I've summited Kilimanjaro," he'd said, a lie he'd told so often he almost believed it himself. The truth was he'd paid for a luxury tour that had helicoptered him most of the way up. But he had the gear, the best money could buy. Carbon fiber trekking poles, boots with a tread pattern inspired by lunar rovers, a jacket made of a fabric developed for deep space exploration. He'd felt invincible as he stepped onto the trailhead, the scent of pine and damp earth, a novel perfume. The forest had been deceptively beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, painting the forest floor in shifting patterns of gold and green. The air was clean, pure, a stark contrast to the recycled, climate-controlled atmosphere of his office. For the first hour, he'd felt a surge of triumph, a sense of conquest. This was all his. The ancient, towering pines, the babbling brook that snaked its way through the undergrowth, the shy deer that had darted across his path. He owned its future. The change had been subtle at first, a gradual darkening of the sky, a chill in the air that his high-tech jacket couldn't quite repel. He'd checked his watch, a ridiculously expensive chronometer that could supposedly survive re-entry from orbit. He should turn back. But a stubborn pride, the same foolish pride that had fueled his entire life, pushed him onward. Just to the next ridge, he'd told himself. Just to see the full expanse of his new kingdom. The storm had struck without warning, a sudden, malevolent ambush. The sky had turned a bruised, angry purple, and the world had dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and rain. In his panic, he'd strayed from the barely there trail, convinced he could cut through a ravine to find shelter. It was in that ravine that his ankle had twisted, the sickening pop of it loud even over the wind. And now he was here, huddled under a granite overhang that offered minimal shelter, shivering uncontrollably, the icy rain seeping into his very soul. Pain was a throbbing, insistent drumbeat in his ankle, and a deeper, more profound pain was blooming in his chest. The terrifying realization that his money, his power, his carefully constructed identity were all utterly worthless. The forest didn't care about his stock portfolio. The storm couldn't be threatened with a lawsuit. Nature, in its raw and terrifying indifference, was the one boardroom where he had no leverage at all. Night fell not as a gentle transition, but as a heavy, suffocating blanket. The storm eventually subsided, replaced by a dripping, unnerving silence, broken by the unfamiliar hoots and rustles of nocturnal creatures. Arthur's shivering intensified. He tried to start a fire, fumbling with the waterproof matches and fire starter from his survival kit. His hands were numb, clumsy, and the kindling he gathered was hopelessly sodden. After a dozen failed attempts, he threw the kit against the rock in a fit of impotent rage, the sound of the plastic case cracking a small, pathetic punctuation mark in the vast, dark wilderness. Hunger began to gnaw at him, a hollow, aching emptiness. He'd packed 2 protein bars, scoffing at the idea of needing more for a simple day hike. He devoured one in 3 bites, the synthetic, chalky taste a mockery of the gourmet meals he was accustomed to. He was a man who could have a Michelin star chef flown to his private island on a whim, and here he was, fantasizing about a simple piece of bread. Sleep was impossible. Every time he drifted off, a fresh wave of cold would jolt him awake, or a phantom snap of a twig would send a jolt of adrenaline through him. He saw shadows move in the periphery, his overstimulated mind conjuring bears and wolves from the shifting shapes of ferns and fallen logs. He thought about his daughter, Chloe. He hadn't spoken to her in 6 months, not since their last argument over her lack of ambition. She was an artist, a painter. She saw beauty in things he couldn't monetize. He'd called her passion a hobby, a foolish waste of a Vassar education he'd paid for. He remembered the look in her eyes, a mixture of hurt and defiance, as she'd told him, "You don't see people, Dad. You only see assets and liabilities." The memory was a fresh wound, more painful than his throbbing ankle. He would give every dollar he had, every building with his name on it, just to hear her voice right now. The next day was a blur of misery. He tried to walk, using a sturdy branch as a crutch, but the pain in his ankle was excruciating. He managed only a few hundred yards before collapsing in a heap, his body screaming in protest. The forest that had seemed so beautiful was now a prison. Every tree looked the same, a relentless, repeating pattern of green and brown that offered no clues, no way out. The silence was worse than the storm. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that amplified his own desperate thoughts. He was going to die here. The thought wasn't hysterical anymore. It was a calm, cold certainty. The great Arthur Vance, the titan of industry, was going to die of exposure and stupidity, his body eventually found by a hunter, a feast for insects and scavengers. There would be headlines, of course, a brief, sensationalized flurry of media attention. His rivals would offer insincere condolences while secretly circling his empire like vultures. His children would inherit a fortune, and their grief would be complicated, perhaps even diluted by the sheer, staggering weight of the money. His life would be reduced to a number in a balance sheet. He had built nothing that would truly last, nothing that would be mourned beyond its monetary value. He wept then, for the first time since he was a small boy, a lost and lonely child, cowering in a closet while his parents screamed at each other in the next room. He wept for the man he had become, for the father he had failed to be, for the life he had so thoroughly wasted in the pursuit of things that could not love him back. He lost track of time. Day bled into night, hunger into delirium. He finished his last protein bar and licked the wrapper clean. He drank from a stream, the cold water a shock to his system, and worried vaguely about parasites, a fear that seemed absurd given his larger predicament. He started talking to himself, his voice a hoarse croak. He argued with his father, a man long dead, who had taught him that compassion was a weakness. He pleaded with his first wife, the only one he thought he might have truly loved, to forgive him for the affairs he hadn't even bothered to hide. He saw Chloe's face in the dappled sunlight, her expression one of profound disappointment. He was beginning to hallucinate, his mind a fever dream of past regrets and present terrors. He was lying on a bed of damp leaves, the last vestiges of his strength seeping into the cold earth, when he first saw her. She was standing 20 feet away, partially obscured by the broad leaves of a fern. A little girl, no older than 9 or 10. She wore a simple, homespun dress the color of faded blueberries, and her feet were bare, her toes gripping the mossy ground as if she were rooted to it. Her hair was a wild, tangled mane of sun-bleached brown, and her eyes, large and startlingly clear, were the color of the forest floor, a deep, knowing shade of hazel. She wasn't smiling, nor was she frowning. She was just watching him with a calm, unnerving placidity, like a deer observing a strange, loud creature that had stumbled into its domain. Arthur blinked, certain she was another hallucination, a figment of his dying brain. He squeezed his eyes shut and opened them again. She was still there. She took a tentative step forward, her movements silent, fluid. She moved like she was part of the forest, not an intruder in it. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The girl didn't answer. She tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. She held something in her hand, a small woven basket. Are you real?" Arthur asked, the question sounding insane even to his own ears. The girl took another step, then another, until she was standing just a few feet away. She crouched down, her movements as graceful as a cat's. She reached into her basket and pulled out a handful of dark red berries. She held them out to him in her small, dirt-smudged palm. Arthur stared at the berries. They looked like jewels against her skin. His stomach cramped with a pang of desperate hunger, but a lifetime of suspicion held him back. They could be poisonous. This could be a trap. A strange, woodland hallucination offering him a beautiful death. But then he looked into her eyes again. There was no malice there, no trickery, only a profound, quiet empathy. A simple offering. With a trembling hand, He reached out and took one of the berries. It was warm from her skin. He put it in his mouth. The taste was an explosion of sweet, tart flavor, the most delicious thing he had ever eaten in his entire, pampered life. It tasted like life itself. He ate another, and another, until they were all gone. The girl watched him, her expression unchanging. When he was finished, she stood up, turned, and started to walk away. "Wait!" Arthur cried, a surge of panic washing over him. "Don't leave me!" The girl stopped and looked back at him over her shoulder. She beckoned with a slight nod of her head, a clear, unmistakable invitation. "Follow me." Hope, a feeling he hadn't experienced in days, surged through him, so powerful it was almost painful. Using his makeshift crutch, he pushed himself to his feet, hissing as a fresh wave of agony shot up from his ankle. He didn't care. He would crawl if he had to. He stumbled after the silent, barefoot girl, his guide out of the hell he had so arrogantly walked into. The journey was agonizing. Every step was a fresh torment, his ankles screaming in protest. The little girl, whom he'd decided to call Lily in his own mind as she offered no name, moved with an effortless grace, never seeming to tire. She would walk a short distance, then wait for him to catch up, her patience as vast and silent as the forest itself. She never spoke a word, but her actions were a language he was slowly beginning to understand. When he faltered, she would pause, her gaze encouraging. When he had to stop and rest, she would sit nearby, sometimes weaving blades of grass into intricate patterns, other times just watching the canopy above. She led him to a spring of crystal-clear water bubbling up from between two rocks, and he drank until he felt sick, the pure, cold liquid a balm to his parched throat. She pointed out a patch of mushrooms, their vibrant orange caps a stark contrast to the green undergrowth. She would shake her head at some, but not at others, gathering them in her basket. Arthur, who wouldn't eat a mushroom in a restaurant unless he knew its exact provenance, found himself trusting this silent child implicitly. She was a creature of this place, and he was a trespasser. He had to cede to her wisdom. They walked for hours, a strange, silent pair moving through the deep woods. Arthur's world, once filled with the cacophony of ringing phones, shouting traders, and endless meetings, had been reduced to the simple, rhythmic sounds of their passage. The crunch of leaves under his good foot, the thud of his crutch, the whisper of the wind in the pines, and the near-silent padding of the girl's bare feet. He started to notice things he would have previously overlooked. The intricate lace of a spider's web, glistening with dew. The way the sunlight caught the iridescent wings of a dragonfly. The earthy, complex scent of decaying leaves and rich soil. His senses, long dulled by the sterile environments he inhabited, were slowly, painfully coming back to life. He was no longer Arthur Vance, CEO. He was just a man, injured and humbled, following a small girl through a world that operated on a logic far older and more profound than any market trend. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. When he finally smelled it, wood smoke. A faint elusive scent at first, but it grew stronger with every limping step. It was the most beautiful smell in the world. It smelled of warmth, of shelter, of civilization. A sob of relief escaped his lips. Lily led him into a small clearing, and there it was, a cabin. It was a small rustic structure built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney from which a thin plume of gray smoke spiraled lazily into the evening air. It was a simple, unadorned dwelling, yet it looked more beautiful to Arthur than any skyscraper he had ever built. It looked like a home. A man emerged from the cabin as they approached. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and a thick, dark beard threaded with gray. He wore simple denim trousers and a flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, sinewy forearms. He held an axe in one hand, and his posture was wary. His eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of the disheveled, injured stranger stumbling out of his woods. He looked from Arthur to the girl, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Lily," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "You brought a guest." So her name was Lily. Arthur felt a ridiculous sense of pride at having guessed it. Lily ran to the man and hugged his leg, looking up at him with an expression of complete trust. The man rested a large, calloused hand on her head. His gaze then returned to Arthur, and the wariness was back. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone not unkind but cautious. "What happened to you?" Arthur leaned heavily on his crutch, suddenly aware of his appearance. His expensive clothes were torn and filthy, his face was covered in a several-day-old stubble, and he knew he must look like a wild man. "My name is Arthur Vance," he began, his voice hoarse. "My plane—" "No, that's not right. I was hiking. There was a storm. I fell. I think my ankle is broken." He felt a wave of dizziness and swayed on his feet. The man's cautious expression shifted to one of concern. He set the axe down and strode forward, effortlessly looping an arm around Arthur's waist to support him. The man was surprisingly strong. "Easy there," he said. "Let's get you inside." The inside of the cabin was a single, large room, bathed in the warm, flickering light of a fire in the stone hearth and several oil lamps. It was simple, rustic, but impeccably clean, and filled with a sense of peace. A sturdy wooden table and chairs stood in the center of the room. A small, curtained-off area likely served as a bedroom. Shelves lined one wall, filled with glass jars of preserved fruits and vegetables. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something delicious cooking over the fire. It was the antithesis of his own home, a minimalist glass box designed by a famous architect to be admired, not lived in. This cabin was clearly a place of life. The man helped Arthur into one of the wooden chairs, his movements gentle but efficient. "Elias," the man said, introducing himself as he knelt to examine Arthur's ankle. "My name is Elias." He carefully cut away the leg of Arthur's expensive hiking trousers with a small, sharp knife. Arthur flinched as Elias's calloused fingers probed the swollen, discolored flesh. "It's not broken," Elias announced after a moment, "but it's a bad sprain. You're lucky. A breakout here. That would have been a different story." Elias stood up and went to a shelf, retrieving a wooden bowl and a small cloth sack. He mixed a pungent-smelling green paste of crushed herbs and water. "This will help with the swelling," he explained, applying the poultice to Arthur's ankle. The paste was cool and soothing. He then wrapped the ankle tightly with a clean strip of cloth. Lily, who had been watching silently from the corner, came forward with a steaming mug. She handed it to Arthur. It was a simple, earthy broth, but it was hot and savory, and it warmed him from the inside out. He drank it greedily, not caring that it scalded his tongue. He looked from the father to the daughter, a wave of gratitude so intense it almost brought him to tears washing over him. These people, these strangers, living a life he couldn't begin to comprehend, had shown him more kindness than he had experienced in years. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done. You saved my life." Elias just nodded, his expression unreadable as he stoked the fire. "The forest provides what is needed," he said cryptically, "and sometimes it brings what is lost." Later they ate dinner. It was a simple stew of vegetables, foraged mushrooms, and what Elias said was rabbit, served with a dense, dark bread. It was the best meal Arthur had ever had. He ate until he was full, a sensation he hadn't truly felt in years, his usual diet consisting of rushed, unsatisfying meals eaten at his desk or in sterile, formal restaurants. After dinner, Elias offered him a bed, a simple straw-stuffed mattress in a small loft area, reached by a wooden ladder. It was a world away from his custom-made, climate-controlled bed in the city, but as Arthur lay down, pulling a heavy, handmade quilt over himself, he knew he would sleep more soundly than he had in a decade. As he drifted off, his last conscious thought was of the irony of his situation. He had come here to conquer this land, to bend it to his will. And instead, it had broken him, stripped him bare, and then, in the form of a silent little girl and her cautious father, it had saved him. He spent the next several days in the cabin, a forced convalescence that was both a prison and a sanctuary. His ankle was still too swollen and painful to walk on, and Elias was firm. "You'll do more damage if you rush it. The body knows its own time for healing. You city folk are always in a hurry." Arthur, a man whose entire life was a race against the clock, found the enforced stillness maddening at first. There was no phone, no internet, no television, no stock tickers to watch, no urgent emails to answer. The only rhythm was the rising and setting of the sun, the crackle of the fire, the quiet, deliberate pace of Elias and Lily's life. He tried to assert his old self, the man of power and influence. "You must have a radio," he insisted on the second day. "We need to contact the authorities. There will be a search party. My company, my family. They'll be worried." Elias, who was patiently carving a piece of wood with a small, sharp knife, didn't look up. "The nearest town is a 2-day walk from here, and that's for someone with 2 good legs. We don't have a radio. We don't have much use for the noise of the outside world." "But I have to get back," Arthur sputtered, incredulous. "I have a multi-million-dollar deal I'm supposed to be closing. People are depending on me." Elias finally looked up, his gaze steady and penetrating. "Are they?" he asked quietly. "Or are they depending on your money?" The question hung in the air, sharp and uncomfortable. It was a question Arthur had no answer for. He tried a different tactic. Bribery. "Look, I can pay you," he said, trying to sound reasonable. "Handsomely. When I get back to the city, I'll send you a check. Whatever you want. $10,000? 20? Just name your price." For the first time, a flicker of something hard and cold appeared in Elias's eyes. He set his carving down. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice low and even, "you are a guest in my home. We are helping you because you are a human being in need of help. That is the only currency that matters here. Your money is as useless to me as a handful of pebbles. Do not insult me by offering it again." Arthur felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He had spent his entire life believing that everything and everyone had a price. The idea that his wealth, the very source of his identity and power, was worthless. Here was a concept so foreign it felt like a physical blow. He was stripped of his only weapon, his only tool of negotiation. He was just Arthur, the injured man. Nothing more. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to surrender to the rhythm of the cabin. He watched Lily. She was a fascinating, otherworldly creature. She rarely spoke, but she was constantly engaged with the world around her. She would spend hours in the forest, returning with her basket full of berries, nuts, and strange herbs that Elias would use for cooking or medicine. She seemed to have a deep, intuitive understanding of the natural world. She knew which plants were for healing and which were for eating. She could mimic the calls of different birds perfectly. She would sit by the fire in these evenings, her small hands busy weaving intricate little figures from river reeds. A deer, a bird, a fox. She gave one to Arthur, a small, perfectly formed owl. He held it in his palm, marveling at the craftsmanship, the simple, unadorned beauty of it. It was a gift, freely given, with no expectation of anything in return. He couldn't remember the last time someone had given him something that wasn't part of a transaction. He watched Elias work. The man was a master craftsman. He was building a new chair, shaping the wood with hand tools Arthur had only ever seen in museums. There was no rush to his work, only a deep, focused concentration. Every cut, every chisel mark, was deliberate and precise. He was not merely building a chair, he was coaxing it out of the wood, honoring the grain, the spirit of the tree it had come from. "Where did you learn to do this?" Arthur asked one afternoon, genuinely curious. "My father taught me," Elias said without looking up from his work. "And his father taught him. We've always been woodcarvers. We take from the forest only what we need, and we try to make something beautiful from it, a way of saying thank you." Arthur thought of his own father, who had taught him how to read a balance sheet and how to exploit a competitor's weakness. He'd taught him that the world was a battlefield, and the only goal was to win. He had never been taught how to create something with his own hands, how to find beauty in simplicity. The days settled into a routine. In the mornings, Elias would tend to his garden or chop wood. Lily would go on her foraging expeditions. Arthur would sit by the fire, his ankle propped up, and do nothing. At first, the nothingness was a torment. His mind, accustomed to constant stimulation, raced with anxieties about his business, his abandoned life. But gradually, the silence of the forest began to seep into him. He started to listen. He heard the subtle symphony of the woods, the chattering of squirrels, the distant cry of a hawk, the gentle rustle of leaves. He began to feel a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. One evening, as Elias was oiling the newly finished chair, Arthur felt a sudden, strange impulse. Could you teach me?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Elias looked at him, surprised. "Teach you what?" "To do that," Arthur said, gesturing with his head toward the wood. "To carve something." Elias studied him for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he nodded. "I suppose so." The next day, Elias gave him a small block of soft pine and a simple carving knife. "Start with something simple," he said. "Don't try to make something. Just try to understand the wood. Feel how the blade wants to move." Arthur's first attempts were clumsy, pathetic. He was used to commanding things to happen, to bending the world to his will through sheer force of personality and finance. But the wood was unforgiving. It didn't respond to force. It had to be persuaded, understood. He cut himself twice, small, shallow nicks that were a blow to his pride. He was frustrated, ready to give up. He looked over at Lily, who was sitting nearby, weaving another reed figure. She watched him, not with judgment, but with the same calm, patient observation she gave everything. He took a deep breath, remembered Elias's words, and tried again. He slowed down. He stopped trying to force a shape onto the wood and instead just made small, tentative cuts, following the lines of the grain. An hour passed, then 2. His racing mind grew quiet, focused entirely on the small block of wood in his hands, the feel of the knife, the smell of the fresh-cut pine. By the end of the afternoon, he had carved a crude, lopsided shape that was vaguely recognizable as a bird. It was ugly, misshapen, a child's clumsy effort. But as he held it in his hand, he felt a flicker of a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a boy. A pure, unadulterated sense of pride in having created something, however imperfect, with his own 2 hands. He had made a thing that did not exist before. It had no monetary value. It served no practical purpose. It was just a small, ugly wooden bird. And he cherished it. That night, a storm rolled in, similar to the one that had trapped him in the forest. The wind howled and the rain lashed against the small window panes of the cabin, but inside it was warm and safe. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the soft glow of the oil lamps cast a cozy golden light. After their simple dinner, Elias took out a worn wooden flute. He began to play, his eyes closed in concentration. The music was beautiful, a simple, haunting melody that seemed to speak of the forest, of ancient sorrows and simple joys. It was a melody that flowed like a river, that rose and fell like the wind in the trees. Lily sat on the floor, leaning against her father's knee, her eyes heavy with sleep. Arthur sat in his chair, the crude wooden bird in his hand, and listened. In that moment, surrounded by the storm's fury, in this small cabin with these two strangers, he felt a sense of belonging, of peace, that his millions had never been able to buy him. He looked at Elias, a man with literally nothing by the world's standards, and saw a richness he couldn't comprehend. He had his daughter, his craft, his home, his music. He was a king in his own small, self-sufficient kingdom. And Arthur, the man who had everything, realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that he had nothing at all. He thought about the resort he had planned to build, the sleek, modern buildings, the infinity pools, the golf course. He had seen the architectural renderings 100 times. He had been proud of them. Now the images in his mind seemed obscene, a violent desecration. He pictured the bulldozers tearing through this ancient forest, ripping up the trees, silencing the birdsong, paving over the memory of this place. He pictured them plowing through this very clearing, tearing down this small cabin, this sanctuary that had saved his life. And he felt a profound, sickening sense of self-loathing. He was the monster in the story. He was the darkness that was coming to destroy this small pocket of light. He had to tell them. The secret was a poison in his gut. The next morning, the air fresh and clean after the storm, he found Elias by the stream, sharpening his axe on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone was the only sound. "Elias," Arthur began, his voice unsteady. He had rehearsed this speech a dozen times in his head, but now the words felt clumsy and inadequate. Elias didn't stop his work. "I have something to tell you, something you need to know about me." Elias paused, looking up at him, his eyes clear and calm. "I already know," he said simply. Arthur stared at him, dumbfounded. You know? How could you possibly know?" "This is a small part of the world, Mr. Vance," Elias said, returning to his work. "But word travels. A man from the town came through a week ago hunting. He spoke of a rich man from the city buying up the whole mountain. A man who planned to build a great, fancy hotel for other rich people. A man named Vance. He said this man got lost in the woods during the storm. I put the pieces together." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. "So you knew? All this time, you knew who I was? You knew I was the man who was planning to destroy your home?" Elias set the axe down and wiped his hands on his trousers. He turned to face Arthur fully. His expression was not one of anger, but of a deep, profound sadness. "I knew what you were planning to do," he corrected gently. "I did not know who you were. They are not always the same thing." Arthur was speechless. He had expected rage, accusations, hatred. He had prepared his defenses, his justifications about progress and economics. But this quiet, sorrowful acceptance disarmed him completely. "Why?" Arthur finally managed to ask. "Why would you help me? Why would you take me in and care for me, knowing I was your enemy?" Elias looked away, his gaze fixed on the dense green wall of the forest. "Lily found you," he said, as if that explained everything. "She doesn't see enemies. She sees a creature in pain. She brought you here. I could not turn you away. It is not our way." He looked back at Arthur, his gaze piercing. "And besides," he continued, I did not believe that the man who carved that little bird for my daughter was the same man who would tear down her home. Arthur looked down at his hands. He hadn't even realized he'd done it. The previous evening, after carving his own clumsy bird, he had stayed up late by the fire, carving another. A small, slightly more refined version of the owl Lily had woven from reeds. He had left it by her sleeping mat as a gift. A thank you. Elias had seen it. I wanted to believe, Elias said, his voice barely a whisper, that the forest had brought you here for a reason, not just to be saved, but to be changed. The conversation left Arthur shaken to his core. He was adrift, his entire worldview shattered. Everything he had built his life upon, the pursuit of wealth, the acquisition of power, the belief in his own superiority, had been exposed as a hollow fraud. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, replaying Elias's words in his head. I knew what you were planning to do. I did not know who you were. It was a simple distinction, but it was profound. He had allowed his actions, his business, to define him completely. He was Arthur Vance, the corporate raider, the resort builder. But was that all he was? The man who had carved the small wooden owl, who had felt a fatherly affection for a silent little girl, who had wept with gratitude for a simple bowl of soup. Who was that man? He had buried that man so deep beneath layers of ambition and cynicism that he had forgotten he even existed. The following day, his ankle felt significantly better. He could put weight on it with only a dull ache. He knew he was well enough to leave. The thought of returning to his old life filled him with a mixture of dread and responsibility. He had to go back. He had to undo the damage he had set in motion. He found Elias and Lily in the garden, tending to their plants. I'm leaving tomorrow, he announced. Lily looked up at him, her large hazel eyes filled with a sad, knowing look. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. Elias nodded slowly. I will walk with you to the old logging road, he said. From there, it is a straight path to the town. You will not get lost again. That evening, the mood in the cabin was subdued. Arthur felt a profound sense of loss at the thought of leaving this place, these people. He had only known them for a little over a week, but they had shown him more of what it meant to be human than anyone in his entire life. Before he went up to the loft to sleep, he turned to Elias. I am going to stop it, he said, his voice firm with a newfound conviction. The resort. I'm going to cancel the project. Elias looked at him, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. That is your choice to make, he said quietly. Arthur knew Elias wouldn't believe him until he proved it with his actions. Words were cheap. He'd used cheap words his whole life. It was time for his actions to finally have some meaning. The walk to the logging road the next morning was quiet. The three of them walked in single file, Elias in the lead, Arthur limping behind him, and Lily trailing silently at the rear. The forest seemed different now. It was no longer a threat, nor was it a commodity. It felt like a living, breathing entity, a place of profound peace and ancient wisdom. When they reached the overgrown, barely visible track that was the logging road, they stopped. This was goodbye. Arthur turned to Elias and extended his hand. I can never repay you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Elias took his hand, his grip firm and strong. Live a good life, Arthur Vance, he said. That is repayment enough. Arthur then knelt down so he was eye level with Lily. He didn't know what to say to her. How could he thank this strange, magical child who had saved not just his body, but his soul? He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crude, lopsided bird he had carved for himself. He held it out to her. For you, he said, so you don't forget the clumsy city man. Lily looked at the bird, then up at his face. and for the first time she smiled. It was a small, shy smile, but it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. She reached out and took the bird, her small fingers closing around it. Then, she did something that stunned him. She leaned forward and gave him a quick, fleeting hug. It was the briefest of embraces, but it was filled with a genuine, unreserved affection that broke through the last of his defenses. He felt tears welling in his eyes. She pulled back and then reached into the pocket of her simple dress. She pulled out the small, perfectly crafted owl he had carved for her. She pressed it into his hand. A trade. A promise. He closed his hand around the small piece of wood, the feel of it a solid, tangible link to this place, to this moment. "Thank you, Lily," he whispered. She gave him one last lingering look with those wise old eyes, then turned and followed her father back into the deep woods, disappearing as silently as she had first appeared. Arthur stood there for a long time, watching the spot where they had vanished, the small wooden owl clutched in his hand. Then, with a deep breath, he turned and began the long walk back to the world he had left behind, a world he was now determined to change. The walk to town was a pilgrimage. Every step was a meditation on the man he had been and the man he hoped to become. The logging road was easy to follow, a clear path that stood in stark contrast to the tangled, uncertain journey he had taken through the wilderness of his own soul. He emerged from the forest onto a paved road just as dusk was falling. He looked like a madman. His clothes were in tatters, he was covered in dirt and scratches, and he had a wild, unkempt beard. The first car that passed swerved to avoid him. The second, a pickup truck, slowed down, the driver eyeing him with suspicion before speeding away. Finally, a battered old station wagon pulled over. The driver was the old woman from the town hall meeting, the one who had spoken of the forest's memory. She peered at him through thick glasses. "Good heavens," she said, her eyes widening in recognition. "You're that Mr. Vance, aren't you?" Arthur nodded, too exhausted to speak. "Get in," she said, pushing open the passenger door. "You look like you've been wrestling with God and lost." During the short drive to town, she didn't ask many questions. She just kept glancing at him, a mixture of pity and something else, perhaps a touch of vindication, in her eyes. "The forest has a way of testing a man's soul," she said, as if to herself. "Some it spits back out, some it keeps." She dropped him at the one small motel in town where his room had been kept, his black sedan still parked out front, a gleaming black beetle that looked alien and out of place. The moment he stepped into the motel room, the modern world rushed back in with a vengeance. He turned on his phone, and it immediately exploded with a relentless series of pings and buzzes. Hundreds of emails, voicemails, and text messages. His assistant, his lawyers, his board members, all in a panic. The media had gotten wind of his disappearance, and the story had become a national sensation. "Billionaire mogul vanishes in remote wilderness." The headlines were breathless and sensational. His company's stock had taken a slight dip. For a moment, the old Arthur felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the Pavlovian response to a crisis. He had to take control, manage the narrative, reassure the market. But the feeling was fleeting, replaced by a profound weariness. He ignored the frantic messages. He stripped off his filthy, torn clothes and stepped into the shower. The hot water felt like a desecration, washing away the scent of pine and wood smoke, the honest dirt of the forest. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The face that stared back was a stranger's. Thinner, haggard, but his eyes were different. The hard, cynical gleam was gone, replaced by something softer, something more thoughtful. The search parties, it turned out, had been extensive. Helicopters, search dogs, teams of volunteers. They had combed the forest for days, but he had been too deep, in a part of the woods the maps had labeled as impassable. They had officially called off the search yesterday, presuming him dead. His resurrection was going to be a major news event. His first call was not to his assistant or his board, but to his daughter, Chloe. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and fear. "Dad? Oh my God, Dad, where have you been? We thought you were dead." He closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cool glass of the window. "I'm okay, Chloe," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." He didn't just mean for the past week. He meant for everything. For the missed birthdays, the broken promises, the years of putting his business before his own child. They talked for over an hour, the longest, most honest conversation they had ever had. He didn't tell her everything about Lily and Elias. It felt too personal, too sacred to share over the phone. But he told her he had been lost, and that he had been helped by good people. He told her he had done a lot of thinking. He told her that she had been right about everything. When he hung up, he felt a lightness he hadn't felt in years, the easing of a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying. His next call was to his second-in-command, a ruthless pragmatist named Marcus who had been his protege for 20 years. "Arthur, thank God. The market opens in 6 hours. We need a statement, a press conference." "Shut up, Marcus," Arthur said, the old tone of command returning, but this time with a different purpose. "Call the lawyers. Call the development team. The Elysian Resort project in Silver Creek is dead. Cancel it immediately." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Arthur, are you all right? Did you hit your head? We have over $100 million sunk into that project already." "I am more all right than I have been in my entire life," Arthur said calmly. "And I don't care if we have $1 billion sunk into it. We are not touching that land. We're pulling out. And what's more, we're going to use our resources to help the town establish a land trust. We're going to gift the entire parcel to a new conservancy, ensuring that it remains protected. Forever." Marcus was sputtering now, talking about fiduciary duty, shareholder lawsuits, a catastrophic financial loss. "Marcus," Arthur said, his voice dropping to an icy calm, "this is not a negotiation. It is an order. Make it happen." The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The story shifted from lost billionaire found to eccentric mogul scraps flagship project. Wall Street was aghast. His board tried to oust him. He was called a fool, a madman, an emotional liability. He didn't care. He sold off a significant portion of his shares in his own company, enough to cover the losses and establish the conservancy, a move that stunned the financial world. He personally flew to Silver Creek and attended another town hall meeting. This time, he didn't stand at a podium and deliver a polished speech. He stood in the middle of the room and spoke from the heart. He apologized. He told them he had been wrong, that he had been blinded by greed and had failed to see the true value of what they had. He announced the formation of the Silver Creek Conservancy, funded by a personal endowment of $50 million to be managed by a board of local citizens, including the old woman who had given him a ride, whose name he learned was Eleanor. The town was stunned into silence, then erupted into applause. In the back of the room he saw the mayor, his face a comical mixture of confusion and relief. Arthur had turned a potential disaster into a legacy. He spent the next few months restructuring his life. He stepped down as CEO of his company, retaining a seat on the board, but removing himself from the day-to-day operations. He sold his cold, minimalist penthouse and bought a smaller, warmer apartment with a studio space for Chloe. He started to paint with her, his first clumsy efforts with a brush mirroring his first clumsy efforts with the carving knife. He was terrible at it, but he loved it. He started a foundation dedicated to funding small-scale, sustainable artisans, people like Elias. He commissioned a series of handcrafted furniture for his new apartment from an anonymous woodcarver in the Silver Creek area, paying 10 times the asking price through a third-party agent, ensuring the money would get to Elias without the taint of charity. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after his ordeal, he drove his car back up the winding mountain road to Silver Creek. He parked where the old logging road began and started to walk. He wasn't wearing expensive hiking gear this time, just a simple pair of boots, jeans, and a warm jacket. He carried no phone, no GPS. In his pocket, he had the small wooden owl. He walked for hours, following the familiar path back into the heart of the forest. The woods were a blaze of autumn color, the air crisp and clean. He felt a sense of coming home. He found the clearing, the small cabin with the wisp of smoke curling from its chimney. It was exactly as he remembered it, a bastion of peace in the vast wilderness. Elias was outside, splitting firewood. He looked up as Arthur approached, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. He didn't look surprised. He looked as if he had been expecting him. "Arthur," he said, his voice warm with welcome. "We saved you some stew." Lily came running out of the cabin, her bare feet silent on the carpet of fallen leaves. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes bright. Arthur knelt down and held out his hand. In his palm was the wooden owl. She smiled, a radiant, beautiful smile, and in her hand he saw the crude, lopsided bird he had given her, its wood worn smooth from being held. He hadn't just been saved. He had been found. He had walked into the woods a rich man, and he had walked out a wealthy one, having finally learned the difference. True wealth is not held in a bank account or a stock portfolio. It is measured in the currency of human connection, in the quiet moments of grace that can change a life forever. It is found not in conquering the world, but in surrendering to its quiet wisdom. Arthur Vance had to lose everything he thought was important to discover the only things that truly mattered. He had to be stripped of his power to find his strength, and he had to be hopelessly lost to finally find his way home. Perhaps we all have a wilderness we must enter, a place where our maps are useless and we are forced to navigate by the stars of our own hearts. It is in these lost places that we are given the chance to find ourselves, to shed the skins of who we thought we were, and become the people we were always meant to be. What would you do if you found yourself lost? Who or what would be your guide? The answers might surprise you, and in them, you might just find the greatest treasure of all.